Welcome to the Near Memo, a weekly conversation about search, social, and commerce. What happened, why it matters, and the implications for local. But let's move on to you, Mike, and your interaction, your wrestling with the dashboard of. Can I say the brand name?
Yeah, sure. I mean, I wasn't wrestling with the dashboard. I was wrestling with the client. I still do client work. This is a client who I consult with once every quarter to just make sure that their digital marketing is on path, that their SEO is doing a good job, that things aren't going, sideways on them. And I sort of help them understand the data because often the reporting is obtuse and assure them that things are going right or they're not going right. So they contacted me last week, 2 weeks ago, and said, gee, our visibility seems low. What are you seeing? So I've been tracking their historic ranking across a number of phrases in WhiteSpark, Darren's local tool. And since, first week of November, I have seen a steady decline in their visibility. And,
maps.
In local particularly, right? Organic was fine, but in local search results in maps, which is what WhiteSpark tracks. And my first, I've used it the way I think ranking should be used, which is as a diagnostic tool. You don't look at it every day or every week. You don't even look at it for keywords. You look at it for the general trend. And the general trend was radically decreasing week over week visibility in maps. So I thought that their SEO was going sideways. I wasn't sure how or why. I called in David for an additional consult even. And but then Darren tweeted something about lawyers all going 24/7 on their hours. And it struck me as entirely possible that maybe that lack of visibility, increasing lack of visibility showing in the report was what was happening here. I went back and checked, and certainly all their competitors had gone to 24/7 in the legal space and criminal, which obviously if you're in jail at 1 a.m., you want to be able to call somebody. So justifiably, these people are at least staffing their phones against Google's guidelines, showing themselves as open, but still they're answering the phones. It wasn't easy to check in WhiteSpark because WhiteSpark runs their scans sort of during the wee hours of the AM. So I checked using Local Falcon and found that in fact during the day their visibility was the same as always been, but in the middle of the night their visibility dropped dramatically because they were showing themselves closed at 10. And it just struck me that the reports we use are so contextual and they have assumptions that go into them. And if you forget the assumptions, you yourself give wrong advice or perhaps guide the client incorrectly. I thought the client needed to spend more than they needed to spend. All they really need to do is go into Google and click their hours to 24/7 and be sure that they're able to answer the phones during the middle of the night. But it just points out the problems with a lot of these tools, that what appears to be that story isn't always a story. You need to understand the context of the tool, the point in time it's actually measuring, and then make a more nuanced interpretation. So I did speak to Darren about it. He is changing the product so that a user can sort of more readily identify what time frame they want to see as ranking. That's one issue, is making the tools reflect reality. The other is, I think David pointed this out, it's a really stupid update.
It's really stupid. Even in criminal law, where you might be thrown in jail at 1 a.m., I have to think that the bulk of people have been charged and then are looking for a lawyer at any hour, which they're happy to consult with at any time of day, within some reasonable time horizon. So it just feels like such a strange category to apply this to as a default filter. I totally get the use case for wanting an open now sort of button in the local finder or in maps. But it seems like as a default for Google to fall back on in this category, it makes no sense. Maybe in coffee shops, maybe in bars, that sort of thing.
It's a very limited set of verticals where you're going to be searching for something open now.
Correct.
Right? I mean, retail stores, restaurants, and certain other venues, but not
professions across the board. I mean,
yeah. But even with restaurants, right? I'm frequently doing searches for lunch at 8 a.m. and I don't really, trying to plan out my day.
Well, that's
what's near the meeting that I'm going to, right?
That's the false assumption about local search, is that everything is about right now, but a lot of it is about planning. So that's problematic.
So I asked the question of Darren, who has a fair bit of data on this, of Darren Shaw at White Spark, whether or not it was category specific or whether it just showed up in categories where people were likely to abuse the hours. In other words, is it more frequent in lawyers because they're willing to do anything to get the sale? And because I wasn't seeing it, for example, in my jewelry client.
In real estate also, Matt McGay pointed out.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So I think, according to Darren, and I think this is true, that it's a general algorithm change. It's more visible in categories where it's more likely to be abused, real estate, legal, and Google's guidelines have not kept up with their algorithm.
Nor is their enforcement going to be able to keep up with bad actors. It's just ridiculous.
Right.
So, yeah.
Yes. So, no, it's a huge and growing problem in certain verticals where somebody might be looking at midnight for their next day's activity, and those businesses don't want to lose the search volume. They're all going to start switching. And once a couple of them start switching, everybody has to switch. Otherwise, you lose visibility, as happened with my client. And as I learned, as it took me a week to sort of wrap my head around this stupidity, I realized, this is not as big a deal as it looks like. It's like, let's just go tweak 5 days a week, make them get an answering service, and we're good, And I thought it was a $20,000 problem for them.
Well, it may end up being a $20,000 problem depending on how expensive the answering service is.
Could be.
Three quick points. One is that it's not unlike the sort of herd mentality that exists. Is not unlike what you described with the HVAC guy, the honest HVAC guy that felt like, oh, now I have to get these fake reviews too to be in the consideration set.
Right.
And then this is another sort of illustration of how when Google makes a change, it gets widely publicized, and then people flock to that thing, or they abuse that thing, or you see an immediate sort of shift in tactics to take advantage or to exploit the change, which is which is unfortunate.
It shows the dialectic between reality and a monopolistic search engine that happens all the time.
Well, people are, Google often sort of says, don't look at us, we're not responsible for what's going on. But they are, because they have it's like the sun and its satellites. There's so much gravity there that people do whatever Google suggests they should do or implies they should do.
And allows them to do.
Right, which is the enforcement policing question, which is, as we've talked about many, many times, is problematic. And then the other thing I was going to say is that if enough people, one of the things that you look to Google for is accurate hours information. It's one of the sort of local search mainstays that is useful. Is this store open? And when you find errors on Google, it's very frustrating. And now if we have hundreds and thousands of businesses that are open 24/7, it's going to make that hours data completely meaningless, right? Think about during COVID, that was something that people were really fixated on, is the business open? And in fact, there was briefly a search engine that launched that was dedicated exclusively to giving people accurate hours information. Didn't survive, but it was an app. But that's just going to be rendered meaningless if this is.
And again, the way to solve this is to put the onus on the user to say, do you really care if this business is open right now or not? And if it's not, then you don't have this abuse.
Right. That's a button. That's your button.
Exactly.
Or the other is to surface the visibility of alternative hours, right? So what are your hours for accepting calls versus hours of being open? Those numbers are available, but Google doesn't surface them, right? So if you're a storage facility, rather than being forced to show you're open 24/7, you can change your access to 24/7, but not have people there 24/7.
Yeah.
And Google could easily show people that information because they have it, right? But instead, they're forcing this play into the main hours lazily rather than fixing supplemental hours visibility, which is what they could have done also. Yeah, Google has all the blame here and very little, to show for it. In the end, it's going to be a shit show.
Well, I mean, the theoretical reason for doing this is to be helpful, to be useful to consumers. But in the end, it just winds up distorting the information that's being presented.
Although in criminal law, again, if they're answering their phones, that's what the person in jail needs, is somebody to answer the phone. And hopefully the lawyer maybe get out of bed at 2 a.m. to come bail them out. But so it isn't necessarily problematic in criminal law.
Well, that's a thin slice of the legal profession, though.
Very thin slice, that's right. But what should employment lawyers do? Should they all start flocking to 24/7 because
or estate
people
planning
are home
or
searching
family law? Yeah.
I grapple with this when I'm advising clients. I have a couple in the employment space. Should I tell them to, go make sure that their phones are being answered 24/7 and change their hours? I don't know.
What sort of maybe a final point, which is now escaping my brain. There won't be a final point now. yes. The dashboard itself. Okay, I remember. All right, not enough coffee. Dashboard itself. You have a relationship with Darren, so you can call him up or DM him or whatever, email him and say, hey, what's going on here? Most people who are users of these tools don't have those kinds of relationships, and they don't have access to the information that you had. So they would necessarily draw the inference that there was something screwed up. So having contextual information is not equally available to everybody, So it's how do you, in a situation where you can't call the developer the tool, how do you sort of suss that out?
I mean, I think the first thing is you have to assume that every tool is making broad assumptions and you don't know what they are, right? So anytime you're using a tool, you have to step back and say, where do we sit in this? And that's hard because even if they suspect the tool, you're right, they don't have access to the answer about when was the scrape done. I mean, I wouldn't have known. I just assumed the scrapes were done randomly throughout the day, but they weren't. They were done because of the volume of scraping he has to do and the number of clients. He has to run them overnight. So I don't know how David, maybe you could speak to this. It just speaks to how all of the analytics we're dealing with is a model, not reality, and a slice.
It's a directional model. Yeah.
Directional. Exactly. That's particularly true with the awful GA rollout. And even with Google Search Console, I ran into something this week where the numbers were so off between GA and GSC. And I was like, what's wrong with this GSC report? Well, in the fine print in Google, it says the numbers can be off. Like there's some reasons that they gave. And I'm just like, okay, well, that explains the 30% variance, right? I mean, it's not like a couple hundred clicks a year. It was like significant volume differences. And so, I just think you have to, as you guys have both said, like all analytics should be directional. And what you should really be tracking are phone calls, email form fills, lead Furno chats, like whatever, but track the end contact with your prospects and clients as your single sort of North Star type metric. And your analytics around rankings in particular, and even traffic, given the poor quality of GA and potentially erroneous quality of GSC, like those should really be directional signals for you.
Thanks for joining David, Mike, and Greg. To stay on top of the latest developments in local, subscribe to our newsletter at nearmedia.co. We'll see you next week.